Is there any truth to the fable of Samson and Delilah in the Old Testament? Well, one biblical archaeologist says there is. Let's take a look and see if there's any validity to this for this Old Testament mythical figure. Now, it seems we've all heard the mythical tale of Samson and Delilah from the Old Testament, and most of us who would have a reasonable mind would believe that's exactly what it is, a myth, a fable created like the many mythical figures created in the Old Testament. But yet, there are some Christian fundamentalists that will maintain that this tale happened exactly as depicted by the Bible, specifically the book of Judges. Well, let's see if they actually have a point. First of all, let's take the story itself. The tale begins in Judges with Samson being born to a barren woman. Now, this of course is interesting because it parallels the story of Yeshua being born by supernatural means as well. But that doesn't actually help me believe that these parallels are pointing towards the legitimacy of Christ as a divine being, because the Gospels were written, of course, long after the fact of Yeshua, and it seems that the early church writers molded the New Testament to fit a continuity of the Old Testament. But back to Samson. Like many Old Testament figures, such as David, he had flaws. The largest flaw with Samson was women, specifically Philistine women. He meets and falls in love with Delilah, who has been placed by the Philistines to find out the secret of his inhuman strength. After he fibs to her a few times about the origin of his power, he finally reveals to her that if his hair is ever cut, God will take away the strength he endowed him with. In which during his sleep she cuts it all off, he loses his strength, and is captured by the Philistines, put to a grindstone to work with eyes that have been gouged out. Then, during a festival in a temple celebrating one of the Philistine gods, he is taken for their entertainment, tied between two pillars, in which a blind Samson atones to his god, bows down, pulling the pillars with him, and collapsing the temple, killing 3,000 Philistines, as well as himself. Now, my common sense would take this as nothing more than a fable, because prior to Samson's capture by the Philistines, it states that he killed 1,000 of them with the jawbone of an ass. But if you believe in things like a worldwide flood, I guess you'd believe that tale as well. And not to mention, he lied to Delilah 3 times about the origin of his strength, and she tested each one of them. He told her first that if he was bound with bowstrings, his strength would disappear. So she bound him with bowstrings and he snapped him the next morning. Then he told her that if he was bound with new ropes, that would erode his power away. So she bound him with new ropes and he snapped those the next morning. Then he tells her that if his hair locks are woven together, that for sure would take away his superhuman fortitude. And then she weaves his hair together. Now you would think after 3 times of testing her, he might hold back on revealing the nature of his power, as she's already deceived him 3 times, but then he goes ahead and tells her, just cut off all my hair. Either Samson was the stupidest creature that ever walked the face of the earth, or this is nothing more than a tale. But the fundamentalists seem to believe that there's actually some truth in this tale. Actually, fundamentalists believe all of it. And I'm going to use reference from my old friends, the Associates for Biblical Research. Now, I've investigated these guys' claims before. What they generally do is find a true historical fact and then make the logical fallacy of creating a new truth from this fact. For example, they say they can prove that the old city of Ur existed, which was in Abraham's time, therefore Abraham existed. And I have several videos debunking these types of claims from the Associates for Biblical Research. But who they point to this time is Dr. Brian G. Wood. Dr. Wood is a legitimate biblical archaeologist, but he's also a young earth creationist, aka fundamentalist or some type closely linked. And we all know that once one is a young creationist, that belief system overrides your academic training, and many times raw facts right in front of you. But here's his reasoning. He states that the Samson events were reported by eyewitnesses. Well, first off, what eyewitnesses exactly is he talking about? We know there's stories from the Hebrew time, and many of these Hebrew stories were borrowed from other cultures, like the Great Flood myth from the prior Sumerian culture. We know these things for a fact. Him stating that there's eyewitness account of Samson is absolutely false. There is a fable that states there was an eyewitness account of Samson. But he goes further with his so-called evidence. The temple that Samson supposedly brought down was the temple of Dagon, a Philistine god. The temple does seem to exist, according to my sources, in Gaza, but it hasn't been excavated, as a city has been built on top of it. But Dr. Wood points out a 1972 excavation north side of the city of Tel Aviv. And they've also pointed to another temple that was excavated south of it. And they state that the excavation found that these temples were supported by two pillars that were approximately 6 feet apart, in which a large man could have crossed the distance between the two with his arms outstretched. So therefore, that proves the story of Samson. And then the Associates for Biblical Research in their article point to an old synagogue building that dates around the 4th to 5th century after Christ in Israel's Galilee that shows a mosaic of a scene from the Samson story, specifically him attaching torches to the tails of foxes, as stated in the book of Judges. And there were a few of other confirming mosaics in other sites. And another source states that a seal was found in an excavation site near Jerusalem of a depiction of a feline attacking a human. And this is dated around 11th century before Christ. And it was found close to a river that was the actual historical boundary between the ancient Israelites and their foes, the Philistines. Well, let's take a look at this one by one. First of all, you found some temples with some pillars in it that match a biblical story. So what? A story that was based on architecture at the time. Because many scholars think that the story of Samson was largely created to give hope to the Israelites as they were being oppressed by the Philistines during their early settlements. Now, an interesting note from the National Catholic Registry article I read gives reasonable explanation of how a man could have brought these two pillars down if this happened at all. They note that Greg Ernst lifted 5,340 pounds, setting a record in the strongman competition world, and there is a recorded event of a train weighing 71,650 pounds being pulled by the neck of a man, which many would consider, quote, superhuman strength. So let's just assume that Samson existed, he did have superhuman strength, and that he was at an angle where he was able to pull down two pillars whose placement was probably very shoddy in ancient construction method. Even if all this happened, it doesn't prove a supernatural event, and that's a big if it happened. But thousands of people wouldn't have died in the temple, and that is explained that sometimes in Hebrew texts, they were known to over-exaggerate numbers to gain an effect of the story. But one, this is not proving that this event happened at all, and two, if it did, it's just an anomaly of strength, just like Greg Ernst lifting up 5,340 pounds. Now let's look at the mosaics of Samson. Tiny stone-colored cubes depicting an ancient fable. These would have been painted and formed well after the fact of the Samson event. Just like the Great Flood story in Hebrew text was written long after the supposed Great Flood occurred. This is not proof, Associates for Biblical Research. This is not proof of anything. It proves that someone continued an ancient fable in decorative form. And as far as a seal of a cat attacking a human, who knows what the origin of that seal means? It doesn't specifically say it was from the Samson event, as he supposedly killed a young lion with his bare hands before he found himself in trouble with Delilah and the Philistines. In one interesting article I read, the writer states that the actual Hebrew text would convey that this wasn't even a young lion, that it was probably much smaller than the Old Testament depiction. So again, this is my problem with these types of fundamentalists and researchers. They have engaged in logical fallacy all over the place. They aren't finding evidence of certain biblical events. They are attempting to construct evidence out of other historical facts. In a nutshell, they are saying Spider-Man exists because the city of New York exists. And as I've said before, I'm always researching events of the Old Testament because if I could find enough validity, possibly I can consider the New Testament as legitimate. And once again, Christian fundamentalists, with the story of Samson and Delilah, you have greatly failed to convince me. And if you'd like to check out the debunking of the book of Genesis, check out my playlist at the end of the video. And check out my tale, which I admit is fiction, of an offbeat apocalypse sure to offend everyone, but especially the evangelical. The Second Fall. Link is in the video description as well as the banner. And I'll see you next time as we once again take that sword of reason and reality and thrust it right through the heart of ignorance.